Good evening and welcome again to our health lectures, lifestyle health lectures. I see a couple of new faces, some maybe that aren't here that were here last night, but we're happy each one of you came. Looking forward to our lecture tonight. As you leave today, there's an opportunity for you to sign up tomorrow, Wednesday evening. After the lecture on Wednesday evening, we have a meal prepared for all of you if you want to come. So if you haven't signed up for that, you can do so on the way out. You can sign up for a meal. We're basically trying to give you an example of one of the meals from Neva and Jim's cookbook. And it'll give you a little bit of an example of how good things can taste, even though they're not maybe what you're used to completely. So Jim, again, welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm going to take about 5 minutes, I think I can do it that quickly, to talk to you about hemoglobin A1C, and maybe a few others will arrive and then they won't miss the first part of our scheduled lecture this evening. This is a tiny bit technical, but maybe you can get the gist of it. It is the percentage of hemoglobin, this is what A1C is, that has a sugar attached to it where it wasn't supposed to be. That doesn't hurt anything, but we could sort of stop here, but I'll show you some more. Hemoglobin is found in the red blood cells, as you know. I don't know if you know this. There's a very mysterious thing that takes place when the red blood cells are made. They're full of machinery like all the other cells. Our cells all have machinery to repair themselves, and machinery to make proteins, and on and on and on. And all that machinery is removed out of the red blood cell. This happens mainly in the sternum, in other places to some degree. And then all this hemoglobin is put inside. So the red blood cells, because they don't have the machinery to repair themselves, only last about 3 months. And then they just kind of fall apart. So your body's constantly, every minute, making a few trillion more red blood cells. Well, anyway, a few 100 million. And it was only about 25 years ago that it dawned on someone that if we could measure that kind of hemoglobin that just has a sugar on it, and I'll tell you why that happens, that maybe could give us an idea of what the average blood sugar has been for 3 months. So what happens is when the body is making hemoglobin, I'll show you this in kind of a diagram. As it's assembling hemoglobin, there's a place where there is a chemical there that's almost the same shape as sugar, if you can follow this idea. So you got this, you're making the hemoglobin and there's a spot where there's a chemical that's the same shape. And guess what accidentally happens once in a while? Sugar gets there instead of this other chemical. You got the idea? Body's building this stuff. There's this thing, and because it's about the same shape as sugar, accidentally the body sticks a sugar there. And would it make sense to you if there was more sugar around, that accident would happen more often? Got that? So that's the connection with the average blood sugar that this measures. And here's, you see the red blood cell, those are tiny. And then the artist, I'll point to it here, is trying to make a tiny, 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 tiny spot a few million times bigger. And these two yellow tubes and these two blue tubes with the red iron in the middle, that's hemoglobin. And that has the ability to grab oxygen in the lungs and carry it around in the body. And when there's the slightest change in pH, the acid-base balance, it turns loose of the oxygen and makes it closer to the acid-base balance that's supposed to be there. So that's what triggers the release of the oxygen from this thing. And there it is again. I'm going to redraw it So this picture, I'm going to take away the tubes and just show you the red dots. Are y'all with me on that? The red little things that we call heme. And here's the chemical that's fastened in there in the middle that's the same shape as sugar. So once in a while, guess what gets there instead? Y'all with me? And the scientists realized that this could be a tool, because red blood cells last about how long? About 3 months. It would be a tool to tell how much sugar was there on average for the last 3 months. That's where this comes from. And this is just a repeat of that, so I'm going to pass this up. But then I'm going to show you, this is an actual diagram, and I apologize, I usually forget to make my cursor big, and then it takes about 10 seconds of your time, which I apologize for. So I can point to stuff when I want you to see it. All right. So this, you can see my pointer now, right? Yes. This red line is measuring on the vertical axis cellular damage, no damage, and more damage. And the idea is, as the amount of sugar that's in the blood increases, only here we're measuring it with A1C, but as the sugar increases, what happens to the damage in our body? It gets very large very quickly. You all with me on that? Now this is actually measuring damage to the eyes. You all know about diabetes and its effect on eyes. You can measure this damage to any kind of tissue in the body from high average blood sugar levels, but this happens to be the one for the eyes. They're all quite similar. And so right in here, the scientists have said, let's call from here up pre-diabetes. And let's start calling it diabetes here. What number is that? 6.5. You probably know that. When the A1C is 6.5 or higher, we diagnose the patient having diabetes. Now, any physician, every physician would know this today. I think I mentioned it last evening. I can't recall. I think I did. If you have pre-diabetes, you need to understand that it is diabetes in terms of the damage that it's doing to the body. I could tell you a lot more story about that. But here's an interesting story that I'll tell, and then we'll get into our lecture for tonight. I guess I need to play this thing before I try to move there we go. So those three things we've mentioned. Now, Dr. Jim McCann, I mentioned last evening, he and I and another physician were lecturing at a reversing diabetes program back in Maryland. This has been a number of years ago now. And Dr. Fritz, friend of ours, mine and Jim's too, showed up with a little machine. This was the first time anybody had ever seen this, that would test your A1C in real time, kind of like a blood sugar test. Before that, you had to send it to a lab. And he had paid $8,000 for that little machine. You can get them today for $100. You know how that is. And he was just going around checking everybody's blood sugar. We had about 50, 60 people there with diabetes, and he checking their A1C. And Dr. Fritz was, and he checked the staff, and Dr. McCann had the lowest of any staff member. So what was his A1C? Can you see it on the screen? Can you read it? Shall I point to it? What was his A1C? Here's Dr. McCann, and that 5.2 corresponds to an average blood sugar about 103. You get the idea? And actually, when Dr. Fritz started doing that, after he checked all the people, and then he started checking the staff, I thought, well, let me just tell you, I have a weakness for desserts. Does anybody in here understand that? And Neva serves a dessert every day. And if I'm a good boy, we might even get one more that day. So I thought, I don't want to embarrass the thing we're doing. So I went over way back in the corner and started doing something back there, pretending like I was busy, while Dr. Fritz was checking the staff. And he found that Jim McCann had this lowest of anybody there. And then Jim and I have been friends, oh my sakes. We met when I was just out of college, and he was a brand new physician. Anyway, he said, hey, he saw me over in the corner. Check Jim's. Then he said something interesting. His will be lower than mine. And I thought, yeah, right. But of course, I guess I was stuck, it's no pun intended there. But anyway, Jim was a runner. He's not with us any longer, tragically enough. But and I used to run when I was younger, but I don't like to run. So anyway, I thought I better not embarrass everybody with a high A1C, shall we say. But Jim knew this. I'll tell you what he knew after I show you. I finally got tested, and there's Jim, and here's what mine was. What do you think of that? Jim knew that Neva and I were more careful than he and his wife were. Not a lot, but we were more careful. Even though he ran 30, 40 miles a week, they weren't as careful with the oil question, friends. And that's why he said, Jim's will be lower than mine. I wasn't very sure about that. That's why I went to hide. But anyway, this is the story with A1C. Maybe a little help for you to kind of get a hang of what's going on there. Okay, let's go back to our topic for this evening, which is right there. And we'll start right there. And I knew you'd be disappointed if I didn't show you a picture of my grandson. My daughter loves baseball, and this kid cannot walk. He can stand. So here's the windup, and here's the pitch. Today, this boy is 6'5" tall. Now, these are the diseases, friends, that come to us not caused by a germ or a virus. Just a few of them. We call them degenerative diseases because they occur only because, I say this kindly, because of a poor lifestyle, if you will. And all of these diseases respond to a proper, if you will, lifestyle. It was a few years ago now, but one of my physician friends at a place in Weimar, some of you know about this place, a group of physicians, nurses, and other providers in 1978 bought 400 acres from the state of California. It had been a, did I mention this last night? Yeah. Okay. Weimar Institute. And people come there to get well. I told you, that's right. The price was what? $6,500. But lupus is a tough one. Fibromyalgia is a tough one. I could tell you stories, though, about people getting well from that. One day, one of the physicians called me up. We've worked together many times. He said, Jim, you remember the gal that had lupus? I said, yeah. He said, she's completely well. And you know this, don't you, folks? Lupus almost never gets cured. But it responds to lifestyle. It's amazing. I was going to tell you another story, but I got to quit doing that and carry on here. Claudication is a fancy word for clots that occur in the arteries of the leg. If it's a DVT, that's a deep vein thrombosis. But when it occurs in an artery, we call it claudication, in case that word's not familiar to you. Well, here's our friend John McDougall. We're talking about heart disease. Guess what he says? It's preventable. Some of you, a couple of days ago, I showed you a picture here. This is how many people die every day in this country from coronary artery disease. 6,747's full. You know about this. People, sometimes in just their late 40s, just drop dead. No warning. So it seems. By the way, when you go to the physician and they put you on a treadmill and do what we call a stress test, aren't most of you familiar with that idea? Do you know, I was actually giving a lecture that I mentioned this, and I said, you can have a blockage up to 60%, and that test will not pick it up. What does the doctor say to someone who takes the stress test if their blockages are all less than 60%? You're in good health. They're not in good health. There was a cardiologist, friend of mine actually, she was sitting in the audience and she said, Jim, it's actually more like 65%. Isn't that amazing that you could have that much of a blockage and that stress test does not pick it up? Now, you're going to see more of the detail on this in a few minutes. Fascinating stuff. But this is a tragic thing, friends, that what did John McDougall say about all these deaths, these 6 airplanes full? Preventable. And if someone happens to get that condition and haven't died of a heart attack yet, it's reversible. And I'll show you that story as well. Now, there's many kinds of heart diseases. You can have arrhythmias, you can have all kinds of problems that cardiologists deal with. But when you and I use the word heart disease, we're almost always talking about coronary artery disease. Y'all with me on this? This plaque, are you comfortable with that word? And I'll be showing you pictures of it, that occurs in the arteries. Not just the heart, arteries everywhere in the body, friends. No veins, just arteries. And I'll try to remember to explain why that's the case when I get there. By far the most common disease, by far, is coronary artery disease. And I think this is probably okay with you. Don't you sort of know that saturated fat is really bad for your heart? Don't we all understand that? Americans have heard that. It is true that that's the case. The problem is, they believe then that unsaturated fat would be good for your heart. In fact, what does every American know about olive oil? Good for you. Look carefully at what I'm going to put on the screen. Unfortunately, that is not true. And I'll explain a little bit more detail about that. Do you remember, 35 years ago, the word got out that walnuts were good for your heart? You remember that? Now, the fellow that did the research on that, the very first, now there's others been done since, was a friend of mine. And I heard that he was going to give the lecture on that topic. When you're doing research and some company is giving you money, you're not allowed to talk about it until it's published. So the word gets out. Now this scientist is going to do this lecture. So I traveled to that part of the country. It was quite a ways at the time from where I lived, and sat there in his lecture. And he went on to tell about it and how he did the studies and how people had less heart disease. Now, at the end of the lecture, almost always in a scientific setting, there's about 300 scientists there listening to him. They have a Q&A time. And by the way, did we hand out cards? You're so hesitant to ask questions that we're going to give you some cards so that you can write the question and turn it in, and we'll see if we can't deal with it. Not at the moment, sweetheart, maybe. Thank you. So I had there's 300 people there. I had the audacity to jump to my feet before anybody else and raise my hand. And this is the question I said. Are these replacement studies? And he said, oh, yes. For some reason, he either didn't mention it or I didn't catch it. So let me try to describe this for you, and I'll keep dealing with it. I think it'll become very clear. But what they did essentially was, they're going to give these people a handful of nuts every day. That's what they decided to do. Big person, bigger hand, small person, smaller hand. So it's kind of what we would call dose related. Does that make sense? So everybody's getting kind of the same amount per pound of body weight, something like that. That's how it was real simple. And Americans, of course, heard about this. And I have a cartoon that I normally like. I don't want to make fun of anybody. But where is it here? This is what Americans take from that. The man says, doctor, should I eat the diet before or after meals? It's not on there? What happened? Do I have to make it play first? Here's. So even when I do this, the picture's not up. Is that correct? I don't know. Here's the HDMI cable. And I'm sorry? Oh, you mean it was up there a moment ago? Is that what you're saying to me? Resetting it? Okay. There have to do with other things. Okay, I can tell the way it's acting that it's coming up there. So let's go back to my cartoon. I'm not wanting to make fun of somebody, but this is the idea that Americans have. Doctor, should I eat the diet before or after meals? Follow me carefully. The average American understands incorrectly that olive oil is good for you. So they have their regular food, let's say, and they pour olive oil on it because it's good for you. You are worse off. And when I asked him if this was a replacement study, here's what he knew I meant. As much fat is in that handful of nuts, they're going to take that much fat out of your diet and give you the nuts. So they're getting, number one, the same amount of fat. Does that make sense? Y'all with me? If you'll nod your heads when I ask you, it helps me know that you got it. It's awful. I'm an old teacher, folks, and any of you that have ever taught, you know about this. I don't even have to think about it. I know what everybody in the room is doing. It's crazy, but when you smile or nod it helps me know. So Americans that do this are worse off than they were before. And the replacement idea, follow this if you can. So they're going to take some fat out of your diet and give you the same amount of fat back. Y'all with me on that? The fat that they took out, some of it will be saturated. Fair enough? Just because they took some food away from them that they normally eat is the idea. And if you're following me then, if they replace that fat with the fat in the walnut, which is very little bit saturated. By the way, just for your information, every plant in the world has fat in it. Some plants much more than others. And every plant has some saturated fat in it. But animal foods, which Americans eat a lot of, so when you take some of their food out and you give the same amount of fat back, you're going to be replacing some saturated fat with some unsaturated fat. Does that make sense? Are you all clear on that? Do I need to say it again? Therefore, heart disease drops when you replace some fat in their diet, because Americans have a fair amount of saturated fat in their diets. When you replace some fat in their diet with some unsaturated fat, heart disease drops. Are you all with me on that? That's what I meant by when I said, were these replacement studies? Does the average American know that? Everybody should say no. Are you all with me? I think you'd have to ask 1,000 people on the street before somebody would know what I just explained. Are you all with me? This is how uninformed we are. And of course, it opens the door for misinformation as well. Let's see if we can go back to the slides without losing the picture. Okay. So what's going on here is that over here they're giving people nuts less than once a week. That's the red bar. If they get nuts 1 to 4 times a week, we're talking a handful, that's the kind of yellowish bar. And if they get nuts essentially every day, that's the green bar. So here, we're going to call the amount of heart disease that's taking place in America, we're just going to call that 100%. And as a result of these feeding studies they were doing, there was less what? Death from heart disease. So people that got nuts 1 to 4 times a week, what decrease in heart disease, what percentage does it look to you like there was a decrease? It's at least 15, isn't it? And maybe more like 17. And look at this. Nuts every day. What was the decrease in heart disease? Over 50%, folks, just for one simple thing. A handful of nuts every day. But if you took that handful of nuts before or after meals, what might happen to you? Without replacement, you'd be sicker. Are y'all with me on the idea? How many people, are you with me on this story? How many people on the street would, thank you for reminding me, and there was another hand too, and we'll take them in just a moment. How many people would you have to ask on the street today in America before somebody would be aware of that? I'm not sure you could find anybody that knows that except somebody that, the scientist. Or, listen, the average physician doesn't even know this. They're not taught nutrition. You know that. You had your hand first, wasn't it?
You answered.
Thank you.
I don't understand the replacement. If you're just having a handful of nuts, what are you replacing?
Well, I'm sorry I didn't make it clear. In that study, you take some of their food away. By the way, you control everything they eat. You understand that? These people are in a study, and everything they eat is under the control of the technicians that are doing this, right? So you remove some food that they used to eat, a certain amount, that has the same amount of fat in it that that handful of nuts does.
Like the solid oil on the salad.
Well, it doesn't matter what it is. The point is, you're replacing fat with fat. But what's happening is some of the fat that they're now getting was more of it was unsaturated than what they were having before. That's the point. And at the beginning, I talked about the fact that you all know that saturated fat is bad for you. And this is astonishing, folks, that such a simple procedure could cut heart disease. And when I point at you, it means I will come back to you, if I remember. Heart disease, it's astonishing how easily we could cut it in half. And actually, McDougall says you could do what? 100%. Very interesting. I think you were first, and then Lisa.
Did you say that you can eat the walnuts before or after? Or?
It doesn't matter when you eat them. The funny cartoon is pointing out to the fact he didn't change his diet that he uses. He's going to eat them sometime in addition, and it's so that's his funny cartoon. But of course, he's going to be worse off. You all understand the idea.
So you said that all plants have fat. Do all plants have saturated fat?
Yes,
Okay.
but small amounts. In general, this is a very good question. In general, animal foods are A, high in fat, and B, high in saturated fat. A high proportion of that fat is saturated. In plants, they're very low in fat, except for 4 categories, which I'll mention. In general, plants are very low in fat, which is part of the reason why we do so well on plants. But every plant has some saturated fat in it. And it's not an issue, not a big issue, when it's, it's these smaller amounts.
Not that long ago, coconut oil was all the rage, and now you're saying no oil, so that eliminates that, I get it. But coconut milk has saturated fat, but it's an acceptable amount, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Recipes have
Yes.
coconut milk.
Yeah, you could obviously get too much plant fat, right? The 4 categories, these are not bad foods. These are just plants that are high in fat. Olives, avocados, nuts, and seeds. And so you use them somewhat sparingly. If you're trying to lose weight, you'd use them more sparingly. By the way, there's only 3 sources of calories: fats, carbohydrates, and proteins in food. And fat has more than twice as many calories per pound, per whatever you want. More than twice as many as either protein or carbohydrate. So the problem for Americans is they eat a lot of high-fat foods, so they're getting more calories than they can use, and so they gain weight. Are y'all clear on what I'm trying to describe? Thank you for raising your hands when something wasn't clear. Now, notice that this works for men and women. The bars are shorter, not exactly the same. Women a little better in some cases, maybe. It works if you're young. I don't know if you know that this symbol means less than, and more than, less than 50 it works, over 50 it works. It works for vegetarians a little better, but it works for non-vegetarians, not so good, but it still works. Even if you're not getting much exercise, you still get some benefit. Is the benefit quite more marked when you get exercise? Certain ways, yes. And even if people are overweight, again, this means less than or equal to 24, if you will, 23.9. The body mass index of 24 is where they say above that you're overweight and below that you're normal weight. So even people who are overweight, body mass index above, they still get quite a good result. Which is good news. All right. Now, please. It's a good question, and it reminds me to tell you what this study did here. The things I've been putting on the screen were not walnuts. They've tested since Dr. Sabate tested walnuts, the scientific community have tested all the nuts, and they all do the same thing. And the bars I'm putting on there is the average of all the studies for the nuts. Clear on that? Okay, very good. Thank you for raising that question. Yes?
Peanuts, though, are in a class all their own.
Peanuts are a legume, but their nutritional profile is just about exactly like other nuts. So we call them nuts based on that background, yeah. Good point. All right, so we were talking replacement, and we've talked about that. Let me show you something interesting. I don't think this will bother you too much, this diagram. This is the liver up here, and tucked under the liver is the gallbladder. The gallbladder is just a storage depot, and since I have arrows that I made, I'll do that. There's the gallbladder, and the bile that is stored in the gallbladder is made by the liver and comes down this common bile duct, is what we call it. And if the bile is not being called for at the moment in the small intestine, then there's a little valve that causes the bile then to be stored in the gallbladder. And then when the meal is eaten, the bile is used to help. The bile does not digest, but it helps digest the fat. That's its function, and it's delivered to the small intestine just an inch or so after the stomach. So the liver makes this bile, and the liver increases bile when the saturated fat you eat, or when you eat more saturated fat than usual, or just eat more. So try to follow that. Your body makes bile all the time because we always have fat in our food, but if I eat saturated fat, the body makes more bile. Now, interestingly enough, bile is essentially pure cholesterol. If you dry it so there's no water there, it's cholesterol. And for most Americans, that bile is reabsorbed into the bloodstream at the end of the small intestine. It's called the ileum, not important. And guess what that does then? If the bile is pure cholesterol and gets absorbed back into the blood, what do you suppose happens to the amount of cholesterol found in the blood? It increases. Now, actually, if a person is, I say this kindly, living right, the bile is not absorbed. So what did I say? For most Americans, the bile is absorbed back into the bloodstream. But when you have an adequate amount of fiber in your diet, the fiber actually grabs onto the bile and it's excreted instead of absorbed. This is one of the good things. You all know about fiber is good for you, but that's one of the good things. So the amount of cholesterol in the blood when you eat saturated fat is even higher than it would have been. That's the mechanism, friends, that saturated fat is the problem to make your cholesterol rise more. You all with me on the idea? Okay. And so there's an increase in coronary heart or coronary artery disease as a result. Now, the lifetime risk, ischemia is a fancy word for blockage or squeezing down, was reduced by 31% in those who consume nuts frequently, And by 37%, in fact, we saw some of those figures were more than 37, they were almost 50, in male vegetarians compared with non-vegetarians. Now, this was not a nut study. This is just people who eat some, they're vegetarians, and so they get a benefit in a very similar manner. Higher consumption of all fruit associated with lower risk not only of heart disease, but cancer in the lung, prostate, and pancreas. Remarkable. And there's the citations are here. Most of you aren't too concerned about that, but if you're ever interested to read this in what we call the literature, the citations mostly I have here. Now, 50 years ago, the Surgeon General, without the data, we did not have this data 50 years ago, thought, as he thought about it, that you could prevent a lot of heart disease, maybe most of it. Today we know, you know this, I showed this to some of you a couple days ago, that you can take that almost away, as we already saw from John McDougall. It's not a germ that causes, it's the way I've chosen to live. Now, the very first studies that were ever done to see if you changed people's diet would change heart disease and death were done in 2 hospitals in Finland. The first letter of the hospital name is here, and the death rate from coronary artery disease was about the same, 13 up to 15 deaths out of each 1,000 patients every year. And they did a dietary intervention. That term is self-explanatory, isn't it? And this is what they did. They took the animal fat out of milk and replaced it with soy fat. Tell me what's going on here. First of all, replacement, right? How does the saturated fat compare in the regular milk to replacing the animal fat with soy fat? How does the saturated fat compare? It's less with the soy. You get the idea. The other thing they did was they gave them margarine instead of butter. Now, you've all heard that margarine is terrible. And what do Americans do, uninformed as they are, when they hear that margarine is bad for you? What do? Oh, they start using butter. And let me give you a touch of background on margarine. I can remember as a little boy, some of you are almost as old as I am, and my grandma would buy butter which was white because the government wouldn't let you sell, I'm sorry, not butter, but margarine, which was white. The government would not let you sell margarine that was colored yellow. But they put some coloring in there so you could make it yellow. Remember that? You're not all nodding. You're not old enough. But anyway, I recall. Even back then, it's amazing to me that the scientists, they didn't have any knowledge of this whole thing, but they kind of had the feeling that maybe a plant source of butter would be better. And so they made butter out of liquid plant fats, and it was white. And we didn't know much about it, but actually the amount of heart disease was much less when people were using margarine instead of butter. The problem with margarine is, you probably know, is something we call trans fatty acids. You familiar with the term? And trans fatty acids are bad, but the public has no concept of just where it is on the bad scale. You're probably still a little better off using margarine, but from now on you won't use any, correct? And anyway, they're actually replacing some saturated fat with some unsaturated fat in the butter margarine situation. Are you all with me on that? Okay. Those are the 2 things they did. And notice what happened. I've kind of put the data in kind of a block here. The amount of cholesterol found in their blood decreased 19%. Is that a big deal? Please say yes. And the death rate from heart disease cut down how much? Huge. Just amazing studies done in those 2 hospitals in Finland. Now notice the scientific article. I've taken a few sentences out of it. We feel the findings of our study justify the conclusion that in men, a cholesterol-lowering diet considerably reduced the mortality, you know what that means, of course, from coronary heart disease. Is that true? How much was considerable in this case? 56%. I'm leaving a little bit out. I'll put the whole thing there in a minute. This is some more of it now. The data also indicate that total mortality was favorably affected by this diet. Now, I don't know Mom and Dad. Is this Mom and Dad here? Okay. I got to find a Mom and Dad somewhere. I don't see anybody. Let's pretend like this is Mom and Dad. And notice what actually is in this paragraph is the data indicate, though not conclusively. Now, I won't use Mom and Dad. If a husband says to his wife, "I love you, dear," though not conclusively, would he be in trouble? It just makes me want to scream sometimes, folks, how uninformed the public is. The data indicate that total mortality was favorably affected by the diet. The reason they put not conclusively is it was such a tiny bit smaller, you couldn't conclude it was made smaller by the study. You with me what I'm trying to describe? You know, there's fluctuation in data, isn't there? So it was so tiny, you could not conclude, even though Americans who ever heard about this heard that this cholesterol-lowering diet would cut heart disease by death by 56%. Now, here's actually, I'm going to try to illustrate something. I probably don't need to, but what we call total mortality, actually among the scientists we say all-cause mortality. If you take all the reasons why people die, and this is just a few of them, and stack them up, you have what we call total mortality. Is that pretty clear, right? Or all-cause mortality. Or let's just use one bar there. And the idea was that if death rates went down from heart disease, listen to me carefully, friends. Do not miss this. The total mortality did not change because he said it was less, though not conclusively. Are you with me on that? What does the average American think when you cut heart disease by changing some things in your diet? They think that you're much better off, not in terms of total mortality. Are you all with me on this? This is insane, folks, what Americans do not know. And it turns out, in these studies, and several that have been done since, there was less death from heart disease, but there was more death from cancer. So much more death from cancer that the total mortality was what? Unchanged. So all this stuff about eating nuts or whatever, the total mortality did not change. I shouldn't have said nuts. I'm just talking about changes that people might make from saturated fat to unsaturated fat. Replacement studies conducted. By the way, they did another study in Los Angeles on veterans. This was after the two hospitals in Finland. On veterans in Los Angeles, there was a veterans domicile where they live and eat, and they did the same sort of thing there. They changed a couple of things so there was less saturated fat, but the same amount of fat. Y'all with me on this? So what's going to be in there instead of saturated fat then? Oils. And I said to you last night, when you take the oil out of a plant, what happens to it? It oxidizes, and that oxidized fatty acid is now a carcinogen, a free radical, but a carcinogen. I'm going to talk to you about cancer. I think it's on our fourth session together. What is it, Sunday night, a week from last night, something like that? Okay. This is incredible, friends. The same thing was shown there in the studies in Los Angeles. The overall death rate was just as high as before. But Americans heard that those things that the people did would reduce heart disease, which that was true. Now, let me show you what the study did. What do you suppose? These bars I'm going to put on the screen is the total fat intake. What do you suppose the S is? And the U? So in the studies that I've referred to, both in the hospitals in Finland and in the veterans domicile in Los Angeles, what did they do? They replaced some red with yellow, or that is to say, they replaced saturated fat, some of the saturated fat with unsaturated fat. That much. What does it mean that the two are the same height? I told you, but say it for me. Same amount of fat intake, just a difference in how much saturated fat was being used, correct? Y'all with me on that? Okay, a couple of people said yes. This is what Americans thought they were supposed to do. Doctor, should I eat the diet before or after meals? I was asked to do a lecture at a hospital. It's been some years back. And on this question. And I'm in the room where people are gathering, and for some reason the ladies came more, I don't know why, than the men. And they're all talking to each other, and I'm overhearing them. And they all know that olive oil is good for you. And they're just talking about how they pour olive oil on everything. And I'm thinking, they're not going to like my lecture. It was really interesting. Because all those hospital workers think they, what shall I say, are well informed. And even the physician folks, you'd have to go a long way before you could find a physician that could give this lecture from the knowledge he got at medical school. Now, he may or she may have gotten knowledge since then, which is fabulous. Now, if you go to your cardiologist and they find that you have coronary artery disease, they're supposed to put you on what we call the American Heart Association diet. And it means to cut your total fat instead of 40% of your calories. By the way, I didn't tell you. This 40% means what percentage of your total calories is coming from fat. And why would the American Heart Association tell you to cut your fat intake? Because your cholesterol level would go down, correct? What does this mean? This little red block down here, what does that mean? So they're saying cut the saturated fat way down, aren't they? But cut the total fat down if you have heart disease. Now, interestingly enough, I want you to see a little bit of the detail of what's going on when a heart attack occurs. This is a drawing, of course, not a picture. I'll show you some actual pictures in a few minutes. There are two layers of muscle. They have names that are not important, an outside layer and then a medium layer. And then there is a lining. The artist has painted it white. It's not necessarily white. He's just trying to show you. And this particular artery, the artist, he or she, is illustrating that plaque is building up in the artery. There's something very, very interesting that we did not know all that long ago. Maybe I'm going to talk 25 years. We didn't know that the plaque was forming under the lining. And there's something else we didn't know even for a while. And it's like there came a time when some scientists and physicians started doing angiograms, this is kind of crazy, while people were having heart attacks. And something they saw on the screen made them, if you will, slap their forehead and said, why didn't we think of that before? Please notice this carefully because this is a very interesting and important point. 99% of people that die from heart disease, die from a heart attack. It's because the yellow stuff, the plaque, breaks through the lining a little bit, oozes out into the bloodstream, and a clot forms almost instantly, like in several seconds, right there. Now, the reason that the plaque oozes or breaks through the lining, follow me on this, of the artery, is that the lining of the artery has been compromised by the way we're living. And it allows the plaque to break through. And it's mainly because of inflammation. You all know about this kind of thing. And the inflammation, to a great degree, is supplied because of the oils that we eat. That what happens when we take them out of the plant? They become inflammatory agents. And it's like nobody had any idea that this is how the heart attacks were occurring. Only 1% of heart attacks occur because the plaque filled the artery. And that's very slow, years and years. And what's causing 99% of the heart attacks? That yellow stuff. And by the way, it is soft and gooey. We call it soft plaque. Have you ever heard that term? It breaks through or gets through the lining and causes the blood to clot. It's like instantly. Now the artist has tried to depict this. He shows it with the lining kind of broken pieces. That's not a good depiction. It's still a lining, but the problem is it can fracture easily, and either of these, friends, can kill the person. In fact, you know this. It's still happening today. Somebody in their early 40s, maybe even before the early 40s or middle 50s or something, we say they dropped dead of a heart attack. And they might have been last week to their doctor who gave them a stress test, and the doctor would have said, unless the plaque is what percent closing the artery? 65 or more. Incredible, folks. Again, I'm sorry to repeat my point, but could we teach this stuff to grade schoolers?
Yes.
Sure you could. Should we be?
Yes.
Unbelievable what we do not do. All right, so atherosclerosis is two Greek words. Athero means mush or gruel. Sclerosis means hard. You've heard of hardening of the arteries, of course. By the way, to repeat myself, this does not occur in veins, only arteries. I'll try to tell you why if I get a chance, but I've got to be careful not to keep you too long. And the very first time somebody wanted to see if you could make that plaque go away, I mentioned his name last night, Dean Ornish, Dr. Dean Ornish, a physician from the University of California, San Francisco campus. I think I told you he could, no, this was a couple days ago when some of you were. He could not get money to see if you could reverse plaque because everybody knew you couldn't. It's amazing, friends. He raised the money privately. He got 24 men who had severe coronary artery disease. He at random put them in two groups of 12. And the group that were going to have the special treatment, he did a number of things. This wasn't the best science. When you make a number of changes and you get some result, why is it not the best science? You don't know what did what or which did what. But nevertheless, I have great respect for this fellow. But he put them on a whole plant regimen and cut their fat intake down to 10%. I think I've showed you on the screen the average American is getting about 40% of their calories from fat. So he had to feed them only plants and even eliminate added fats so he could get the intake down to 10%. A very, very low-fat regimen. There's fat in every plant, so there's some fat in this diet. You understand that. He had them exercise. He taught them stress control. He had group therapy and maybe one or two other things if I think about it long enough. And the experiment, and then the control group, this is very interesting. He put them on the American Heart Association diet. What's the total fat intake on that one? 30%. So still a cut in fat, isn't it, from close to 50%. All right. So here is the average blockage. All of these men were sick from heart disease. And what he did was, in the three main coronary arteries, there's other arterial branches, but these are the three main ones we usually talk about. He took each little centimeter of each artery and wrote down the blockage and averaged it over that man, and then averaged the group. Are y'all with me in the idea? So the average blockage in the people that were on the experimental diet was about 40%, not quite half blocked on average. And so maybe like that. And he found after 12 months, when everybody knew you could not get the plaque to go away, he found out that the plaque was reduced by 5.5%. This study is now, I'm talking about 30 years ago that he did this study. That's how long we have known that you can make the plaque go away. Pretty interesting. And in the control group, which what was the fat intake on the control group? He put them on the American Heart Association diet, so 30%. Their average was about the same, a couple points higher, is insignificant. But during that year, on the American Heart Association diet, their plaque increased almost 10%. What? You mean when I do what my doctor says, my plaque's still going to get? Yes. Amazing, isn't it? Just astonishing. And forgive me for this refrain. How many people on the street would you have to ask that knew anything about this? And we could teach this stuff to grade schoolers, couldn't we? Certainly high school. And whether they would make changes in their families, up to them. But I'm on a soapbox for having people know what's really going on. Okay, these are actual photographs. A friend of mine, Dr. Castelli, was the head of the Framingham Heart Study. Ever heard of that? Yes. About, now, 50 years ago? Pretty close. Oh, yeah. More than that. 4,000 men were recruited in Framingham, which is a bedroom community of Boston. 4,000 men were recruited to be part of a study that is still going on today for a few of them that are still alive. Not a few, but some, whatever. And that study has produced, and by the way, why didn't they include women in that? Because at that time, women were only getting 1/10 of the heart disease that men were. Today, women have completely caught up. So about 15 years, don't hold me to that number, roughly 15 years ago, maybe a little more, they recruited some women to be part of the study as well. But the amount of data that has come from this is just amazing. And every once in a while, Dr. Castelli, when there was someone that passed away from heart disease, would do some post-death studies on their arteries. And these are pictures of people that died for some reason, and some of them it was a heart attack. This particular case, this is the inside of the artery. This is plaque all through here. And this is a portion of the plaque that is still soft. And this is where the blood is having to flow. So could you see that maybe that's about an 80% blockage? And the soft, please watch this point. What percentage of people die because the hard plaque fills the artery? I just said what percentage of people die from filling the artery. 1%. That means that 99% of the people die because the soft plaque oozed into the bloodstream somehow, correct? What do you think about this? And by the way, the body is furiously trying to take the soft plaque we make. We never make hard plaque. We make soft plaque, and the body seems to know that it's bad for you and just furiously tries to harden it up. Are y'all with me on that? What do you think about this? Does this look like a very dangerous thing here, covered with this big, hard plaque? Say no. Do you see why? It doesn't look like it's about to break through the wall. Y'all with me on this? To break through into the bloodstream. You're not saying yes. Like, is it clear now? That this is safe plaque. Even though the man or the woman is compromised and probably gets pain when they run or walk fast maybe, but this plaque is not about to kill this person. Got it? All right. Here's another one. Again, here's the inside of the artery wall. Do you understand, folks? It's a cross-section. I didn't make that clear that we're looking at. You take the artery out, cut it off, and look at the end. I'm sorry that I didn't make that clear. There's more of the edge, or the inside, I should say, of the artery. What is this? That's where the blood is flowing. What is this? That's the soft plaque. I think the arrow will point. The lining. In this one, you can actually see the lining. The other one, it wasn't clear. The lining has a name. It's not important. But what do you think about this soft plaque right here? Yeah, it's awfully close there, isn't it? And this is a risky place in this person's arteries. Especially, and in fact, if they decide to change the way they're living, you can, listen to this, folks, you can make this lining safe in a couple of days on a proper lifestyle. I was looking this afternoon for a clip from a physician. She's not a friend of mine, but I have this in a longer film. I was looking for this clip. I looked for 45 minutes. I know it's there. I've heard it more than once, to be sure, where she talks about, and I was going to play it at this point, as an ER doc, after New Year's or some other holiday, about 2 o'clock in the morning, they're suddenly flooded with heart attacks. And she says it's because of that one meal that made something that maybe was marginal, made it worse enough so that they got a heart attack and died. So meal by meal, folks, you can affect how safe the arteries are. Y'all with me on this idea? Even if there is plaque there already. Very, very interesting. Here again, inside of the artery, this is all plaque. And right here, the soft plaque is kind of distributed across a little distance there. But right here is where it broke through the intima. I'm sorry, that was the name. I wasn't going to use that. Of the lining. And what did this piece of soft plaque cause? That clot to form in seconds. Yes?
You know, doctors are giving a lot of Eliquis to people to prevent clotting and blood clots, you know, making heart attacks. But that's totally different.
Well, there are a number of chemicals that you can give and put in the blood that will make the rupture of the intima less likely. Tell me about all of those substances. Are any of them poisonous? What percentage of them are? All of them. So the answer isn't drugs. The answer is, if you can decide to do this, is to change the way you're fixing your food and perhaps your activity and so forth. You all know that's important. I have not talked about it. But this plaque, this clot forms so quickly, it actually catches the oozing right in the in the clot. Very interesting. Tragic, but interesting. So, along comes Dean Ornish, University of California, San Francisco physician that raised the money, and he cut their fat intake to 10% of their calories, and how much saturated fat? Almost none, right? And what did he get? What did he find happened? The plaque decreased by how much in 1 year? Yeah, 5%. And And now we know that decreasing the plaque is not the biggest thing. What do you suppose the biggest thing is? Making the lining what? Healthy and safe from rupturing. This is the really good news, folks, about any of us. Many of us in this room have soft plaque. And it's dangerous if the lining is not healthy, because it forms right under the lining. You're with me on that. The soft plaque forms right under the lining. And then the body desperately tries to harden it. Very interesting question there. Now, if 30% makes you sicker and 10% makes you better, it has to be that somewhere in between you don't get worse or better. Correct? So everybody thinks this is about probably the place it is, and it has been studied in some degree. Here's something interesting. I taught nutrition, college nutrition, for 10 years. And interestingly enough, there was a situation where those students, if they chose to, could eat at Neva's table. She was a matron, not in our house, but she was a matron where if the students chose to, they could eat her food. And even back then, how many years ago was that, dear? I don't know, 20 years? Oh, my, more than that. But anyway, about 29, 30 years ago. Even then, people had an idea that what they ate had a big issue. But I had those students for the whole year, and I had them keep track for 1 month of everything they ate. With computers, it's pretty easy, although that was kind of early in the days of computers, but still it was fairly straightforward. And then you just press a few keys and you get a printout of how much of your food was saturated fat, unsaturated, and all of that. You all with me on the idea? Those kids that ate at Neva's table, their fat intake, listen to this, fell between 17 and 20% over 10 years, all those kids that I taught nutrition to. Is that cool? You don't have to measure anything, really. Just use plants, unrefined, and the chance of a heart attack is extremely small. Even if there's soft plaque, is that correct? Yeah, very interesting stuff, friends. Now, Caldwell Esselstyn gave me this data personally before it was published. He took almost 200 people that the cardiologist had given up on. What does that mean? Go home and prepare yourself. And he tried to get them to follow his program. I think you know what the word adherent means. Almost 9 out of 10 of them followed the program. And out of the people who followed the program, only one person had an event. And he and I have discussed this. He said, Jim, I really shouldn't have put that guy in the adherent group because he really didn't follow it as much as he should. But he did some, and so I put him in. And he had an event. Now, an event is death, heart attack, stroke. You all understand that these are things that would happen because of circulation issues. And in that group, then, of people who were adherent, and these are all folks that are on the edge of the end of their life. Are you all with me on this? Only one person had an event. In the ones who were not adherent, 21 of them died or stroked or some other vascular event. And this was a landmark study as well, how effective this is. Now, replacing animal fat with plant fat reduces death up to 56%. The overall death rate does not change. Is this amazing or not? I'm repeating myself. Nut studies show you can, when you leave the oil in the plant and don't get so much of it, you still get a great reduction. If you reduce the fat intake to 10%, atherosclerosis can be reversed. And that's just a summary. This is a picture on the front of a textbook I have on immunology. And what it's being pictured on a microscope slide is a white blood cell, which we call a macrophage. The word macro is Greek for big or large. Phage, you can say macrophage or phage, either pronunciation. In English, in Greek, there's only one way to pronounce it, but nevertheless, he is named that because he, if you will, I'm sorry about that, he travels around by oozing. This is an amazing organism. Any of you ever give your grandkids or your kids some silly putty, and for some reason you left it out sitting on the counter? What does it look like in the morning? That's how he travels. He travels by oozing in one direction. And this thing can go anywhere in your body. It can travel through bone. It can travel right through the walls of vessels. And they're all over your body and mind, patrolling for stuff that shouldn't be there. And on this microscope slide, the scientists have placed a germ. And he's still alive under the microscope. And this is not his left eye or his right paw. Any part of him can ooze out there, surround something, and now it's inside and it's gone, if you will, from the body. You get the idea. And so let's see how this works with the coronary artery disease. Does this look familiar to you? What's the white ring? It's a lining. The name is not important, particularly for you and me. And then there's these layers of muscle. And I'm going to take a little portion of that and put it full screen. So we will see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen will be inside the artery. The lining we'll see and the muscle cells, but it's magnified enough so that we're going to draw the cells. I actually got this picture from the Framingham study. His name escapes me now. So here's the muscle cells. This is inside the artery. Are you all with me in what I'm trying to describe? This is the lining. I'll circle it in a second. And these are the muscle cells. There's the lining. And here's what happens in terms of forming the plaque. There is some kind of a chemical insult in the blood that attacks the intima, or the lining. For example, in cigarette smoke, there are over 10,000 poisons in cigarette smoke. And many of them are, of course, toxic and get in the blood. There's other possible sources as well. And the cell, I'm going to show the damage to the cell as a dent. It's not a dent. It's a chemical that got into the cell, got through the cell wall, into the cell, and it's going to kill the cell. So the cell dies, this lining muscle. I'm sorry, this lining intima. I shouldn't use the name but there I go again. And a decision, and then the cell dies, and so the white blood cell, the macrophage, comes along and eats up or engulfs the dead cell. Got it? Cool? Now then, a decision is made, this is fabulous, between these two cells, and then we don't know fully how this takes place. We have some pretty good understanding. And one of them then agrees that it will make a copy of itself and fix the problem. Cool? All right, here's the problem. If there are too many fatty particles in the blood, we actually call them lipids. You know the names of some of them. Anybody ever heard of LDL? You might not have heard of VLDL. You've all heard of HDL. There are actually over 16 different kinds of particles. You only know about 2, am I right? LDL, and maybe you know about VLDL. or HDL. The two you know about is HDL and LDL, and maybe more. When there's too many of these, this macrophage, when it is there cleaning up, actually has receptors that grab these things and pull them inside. Why do you suppose our bodies do that? To try to control the amount of stuff that's in our blood that shouldn't be there. Are y'all with me on that? The problem is, when there's too many of those particles and he fills up with them, he dies. And now he's stuck there. Actually, we call it a foam cell, full of fatty particles, if you wish. Every physician knows that term, foam cell. And what do you suppose happens to this dead macrophage? I couldn't hear you? A lot? Huh? Well, you're ahead of me. Who comes along and cleans this thing up? Another macrophage. What happens? I'm using him or her. I mean, what happens to him? He fills up and dies. And this is very interesting, friends. I think you'll be quite amazed at how this works. It is the accumulation of those macrophages that is the soft plaque. Got it? What do you suppose, then, if I could decrease the amount of fatty particles hanging around? Do you suppose that the macrophages could come along and clean all these up? Exactly what happens. You can make soft plaque go away, but you have to be on a pretty low fat intake. In fact, what percentage did Dean Ornish have to get the total fat down to make that happen? I didn't tell you that Esselstyn, in his studies, gets it down to 7%. And does it make sense that you can make all this soft plaque go away? Or that you could make it even safe while you're working on it? Remarkable. So I hope that this has made you interested and feel like there's hope for all of us. This is a little bit complex, but try to work with me on this. I actually got this from Dr. Castelli as well. This is the macrophage. You all with me? And he has a bunch of what? Receptors designed for different fatty particles. And if I'm reasonably living and there is some fatty particles in my bloodstream that shouldn't be there, this guy can absorb them, if you will. It's a very, very complex, actually, thing that's taking place, that the receptors grab and pull it inside. So this is the system that our bodies have. However, there's some very interesting points on this picture. I want you to especially notice when it says slow or fast. What do you suppose that means? It is the speed with which the macrophage is able to pull these things inside, these fatty particles, these LDLs and these VLDLs. And here's the worst one. This is the most dangerous particle. It's actually a conglomeration of LDL particles, and there's a special receptor that does what with it? It pulls it inside how? Fast. So when I live poorly, folks, it's really tough on my body. The macrophage is trying to take care of it. But you all know that LDL is the bad cholesterol. That's a crazy term. You'd die if you didn't have any LDL. The problem is when you get too much. Y'all with me on that, of course. And but the most dangerous of all the particles is what we call LP little a, or LPA, because it's a bunch of them hooked together that quickly get drawn into the macrophage, making it more likely that the macrophage will become soft plaque. Okay. Are your minds all bent tonight after all of that? Okay. I'll quit here. There's some other interesting stuff, but you can kind of tell by the. I think I was going to show you a picture of a really nice cookbook. Thank you for coming. We'll see you. What is it? Wednesday night? Pardon? Wednesday night. Yes.
What do you suggest to cook with? Like if you're cooking your meat, so any kind of oil, anything?
Well, did you hear her question? She says, what do you cook with? And then she said, when you're cooking your meat.
The lean meat.
Pardon?
The lean meat.
Fat or lean.
Go vegetarian all the way.
Well, that's up to you. I just want you to see why Americans are dying. And but Neva's the expert on this. One thing we do some frying, but we use Teflon instead of oil. We do some frying, but we use Teflon pans.
Teflon.
Yeah. And the chips that you're going to that's okay. The chips that you're going to get Wednesday night, we actually started making them today from tortillas that don't have any oil in them. There are some that you can do. And we cut them up in little wedges, and we bake them and salt them. And you know, folks, that most chips you get are bad food, aren't they? You don't want to say yes, but you know that. And but you can make your own chips. Now, it's more work, to be sure, than just buying a bag at the store, but that's what we do. We make all of our own food like that, following the principles that I've been giving you here. We've been living like this ourselves for 50 years. We ran 2 restaurants in Seattle. This is the kind of food we fed those people for 10 years.
And you don't eat any fish or anything?
We don't eat anything that has a face or a mother. True enough? Okay.
Just wanted to make sure you all know that you're welcome to come to a meal tomorrow night or Wednesday night after the meeting, and we still have more spaces. So if you haven't signed up, do so as you leave. We'd like to have you see a meal and see what some of the stuff tastes like.
And I'm sorry there'll be no fried chicken. Sorry. It's all right.
This is the way you're brought up.
Oh, of course, I was raised on a ranch. Listen, we had a T-bone steak cooked over the coals 4 nights a week. It was insane. What, didn't I tell you this? That fat drips down on those hot coals and makes chemicals that are just awful. And that's probably why I got prostate cancer, because of the way I was raised. But thankfully, the doctor said to me, even though it was almost 23 years ago, he said, you're not going to die of prostate cancer, Jim, because of the lifestyle that I was on by that time, see. There's the news, folks, for cancer in this story that I'm going to tell you, I think it's Thursday night, is just fabulous. Somebody had a hand.
Yeah, you were talking about the lining,
The lining of the artery.
how to fix it. You just cut out the oil.
Well, you use a whole plant regimen and are active enough. You know this. You have to be active, don't you, folks?
And you feel fish, seafood, fish?
Does a fish have a mommy?
Yeah, does it have a mother?
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be cute. The point is that all the animal products are way too high in fat and other problems. And if you want, you understand I'm not twisting anybody's arm. You understand that. I just want people to know. I hope people will make a good decision. And my wife, God has blessed this girl, folks. When we married, she will tell you she did not know how to cook. Am I telling the truth, dear? She's nodding.
Well, I knew how to do a Betty Crocker brownie.
Yeah, right. But God has blessed her, and she has put forth a lot of effort. I know I'm a little bit biased, but we've been doing this, like I said, folks, for 50 years. And we have 3 cookbooks that we have produced over those years. And God has blessed that girl. She knows how to make healthy food taste good. In our travels, and we have traveled for years all over this planet, doing classes, people often want to give us some of their health food. And some of it is so bad, folks, it makes me want to, I won't use the word, lose my meal. And I'm sorry about that, but Neva knows how to make healthy food taste fabulous. You talk to anybody that walked through the doors of that restaurant for 10 years, they love it. And we have nice replacements for dessert. We actually had a soft serve machine using our formula for ice cream made of coconut milk and nuts. Didn't we put some nuts in it, some cashew nuts and so forth, sweetened it with fruit sweetener. In fact, at our house, every Sunday morning, we have ice cream on waffles. And I'll give you our address, and anytime you're up in northeastern Washington State, if it's Sunday morning and you're anywhere near, you call us up, you can have breakfast with us. Pardon me? Lisa's coming. And if I'm a good boy, we get it one more morning during the week. Ice cream on waffles and berry topping and so forth. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah, stevia is, as you know, gram per gram, thousands of times sweeter than sugar, and it's a nice supplement. However, it has been shown fairly recently that you shouldn't sweeten more than 2 cups of some kind of hot drink or whatever, because there is a microbial issue where some toxin is made, so it shouldn't be used widely, but it's a great substitute.
I wanted to ask you, is AFib related to diet?
We don't know for sure. I'm sorry to tell you that my wife developed a case of AFib, even though we've been living like this. So it's probably partly genetic. It may be lifestyle. I don't think it's probably very much lifestyle because of that. I know others who have been very careful and it still happens. Fortunately, it's quite treatable for many people, especially if they're in good health. And yeah, she was, if you will, cured. So
I was reading recently, when you have cholesterol studies, you should ask for the size of the particles, if they're small or large.
well, the different particles are slightly different in size, but that's not the big issue, although the fluffy, I'm quoting William Castelli now, the guy that had the Framingham Heart Study, the fluffier they are, the less dangerous they are. So, but that's not usually measured. The real issue is you want your LDL to be below 100. Everybody kind of knows that now. And, you know, my grandfather died of heart disease, so did my father. I'm at risk genetically. You all know genetics is an issue with cancer and many diseases. But in spite of that, it's amazing how much of this is prevented by a lifestyle. And I know, folks, it sounds crazy to some of you, but it's very doable. It takes determination. Even if you spend $6,500, if you don't have determination, you probably won't stay on the plan, right? Probably for most people, a step at a time is a good idea. I was listening today to a fellow. I was looking at some of I'll say his name in a second. Neil. No, not Nedley. Neil Bernard, the name I tried to think of last night. This wonderful man, he has made such contributions. He's the head of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. He wants physicians to get on the bandwagon of teaching people what's making them sick instead of trying to give them drugs. Anyway, where was I going with that? And your question was, I see the hand. The particle size. You don't see that in blood tests. But when you're living a healthy lifestyle, the particles tend to have a more proper size. And but you don't even have to worry about any of that. Where we were going was, for most people, I suppose a step at a time is a good idea. But the point I was making, now it comes back to me, was I was listening to this little clip on his website, and this guy said, we're going full steam immediately. Well, for a lot of you, that would be tough, especially if you have family, right? But you have to decide. A step at a time, if you keep making steps, is great. I think you can find some recipes in Neva's book that are pretty easy to produce. And You talk to anybody that's eating at her table, they will tell you the food is fabulous. It's amazing, especially the ice cream on waffles.
One other question is, how do you, or what do you think of Himalayan salt or regular salt?
I'm going to step on some feet, and I apologize. It makes no difference in terms of your health. People claim it does. It's sodium chloride. I'm a chemist, folks. It's sodium chloride. Maybe a few flavorings from the dirt around it, but you don't have to worry about what salt you use. Now, it should be iodized. Don't go, if you're going to buy those salts and they're not iodized, you're playing around with stuff you shouldn't play with. Now, interestingly enough, in the eastern U.S., the soil has a fair amount of iodine, and they don't have the problems out there we do in the West. But iodine you must know this, folks. When they finally started putting iodine in salt, it just changed the world. And so, well, it depends how much you get. The average American, if they use the average amount of salt, is getting enough iodine from that. And you do what you want, but be careful about some of these claims that are made.
I was going to wait and talk to you afterward because this pertains more to last night's message. But it was very interesting. When I got home last night, we have a friend that has been in the hospital for the past, I don't know, several days now, and he got an infection in his foot and it's not healing. And when I got home last night, I looked at my text and he said that they're talking about amputating him. So
He could save the leg if somebody would put him on a plant-based diet. We have seen it over and over again. The circulation improves, folks, in a couple of days. And once you get circulation, that wound will heal.
how can we help him from here? He's over in California.
Well, that's a question I can't answer. It depends on how much he trusts you, how much opportunity you would have to feed him in the hospital. But you could save the leg. There's no question about it. Send him to Weimar. You don't have much time is the problem. That's like I say, I told you the story. Jim McCann watched this guy several times a day to make sure that the gangrene wasn't setting in. You can't play around with it. But if he could suddenly right now start eating a whole plant regimen, the likelihood of that thing starting to heal is very, very high. Crazy, but it's just the way it is. We should quit, shouldn't we? God bless you all. We'll see you Wednesday. Oh, just a minute. Neva wants me to say. Oh, I'll be happy to visit with anybody if you want to stay a few minutes, sure. We have to quit at midnight, but I'll be happy.